I'm Jan Jekielek, a senior editor with the Epoch Times and also host of American Thought Leaders. We have partnered with the National Association of Scholars to do a new report. Every year, somewhere around 2 million American students take the SAT exam, but the College Board, the organization that writes these exams, has been found to have close ties to the Chinese Communist regime, according to a new report published by the National Association of Scholars. Just how has the Chinese Communist Party extended its influence into the College Board? And how did this impact, perhaps unexpectedly, K-12 education and education overall in America? In this special episode of American Thought Leaders, we'll hear from the experts. Today, we've partnered with the National Association of Scholars to host the launch of this new report, Corrupting the College Board, Confucius Institutes and K-12 Education. To start, I'd like to introduce the report's author, Rachelle Peterson, who's a senior research fellow at the National Association of Scholars. Take it away, Rachelle.
Thank you, Jan. My pleasure. China's interference in American society is in the news almost every day. Just last month, the State Department ordered the closure of China's Houston consulate, noting that Chinese diplomats were coordinating the theft of intellectual property. And then there's China's Thousand Talents Plan, which pays scholars and researchers to share their discoveries and inventions with China. China operates at least 146 talent recruitment stations in the United States. Meanwhile, the U.S. is just starting to reckon with Confucius Institutes, the Chinese government-sponsored centers on college campuses that serve as outposts of espionage and propaganda. And in August, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned colleges and universities about Confucius Institutes, noting their malign influence and encouraging them to shut them down. So far, more than 40 colleges and universities have done so. But even as the nation is waking up to the threat of China, and even as colleges and universities are dialing back their Confucius Institutes, another key organization has partnered with the Chinese government, giving China strategic access to the American education system. That partner is the College Board, best known for the SAT and the Advanced Placement AP tests. The College Board has worked with the Chinese Communist Party, lending it a veneer of credibility and luring in thousands of K-12 teachers, principals, students, parents, and lawmakers with programs that advance the interests of the CCP. The College Board is so closely wed to the Hanban, the Chinese government agency that runs Confucius Institutes, that in 2014, College Board CEO David Coleman described their relationship like this, quote, "Hanban is just like the sun. It lights the path to develop Chinese teaching in the U.S. The College Board is the moon. I am so honored to reflect the light that we've gotten from Hanban," close quote. So, reflecting the light and the interests of the Chinese government, what has the College Board done? And today, the National Association of Scholars released this new report, Corrupting the College Board, Confucius Institutes, and K-12 Education, in which we document 4 ways the College Board has partnered closely with the Chinese Communist government and 5 steps the U.S. should take to address them. The first partnership between the College Board and the Chinese Communist Party has to do with the AP test. In 2003, the College Board developed an AP Chinese language and culture course, and the Chinese government helped fund the College Board's creation of the test, covering about half of the $1.37 million price tag. And in exchange, the Chinese government earned the privilege of influencing what was taught in AP Chinese courses, in particular, pushing for instruction in simplified characters, a more basic set of brushstrokes that the Chinese government imposed on its people during the Cultural Revolution. And as a result, American students of Chinese would be unable to read the older, more traditional literature that Mao had sought to supplant. Instead, they would be, and now are, reliant on newer materials put forward by the Chinese Communist Party. And following the launch of the AP Chinese course, the CCP built out additional programs targeting AP teachers and AP students. The College Board began promoting the AP International Leadership Program, run by the Confucius Institute headquarters, which paid for high test scores to spend 3 weeks in Beijing, learning under CCP-selected instructors. And in addition to targeting high school students with the AP course, The College Board partners with the Chinese government in a second key way to reach all ages by sponsoring Confucius Institutes and Confucius Classrooms, the very programs that the Department of State, the FBI, multiple members of Congress, and the intelligence community are now warning against. The College Board created a College Board Hanban Confucius Institutes and Classrooms network consisting of 20 Confucius Institutes and Classrooms that the College Board helped to sponsor. And through this network, the College Board encourages school districts to host Chinese government-selected teachers in K-12 classrooms, often in immersion classes in which Chinese teachers teach not only Chinese language, but also social studies, history, and other subjects the CCP takes a special interest in. And for those schools too small to host an entire Confucius classroom, the College Board developed yet a third partnership with the Chinese government, by which it built a pipeline of Chinese government-selected teachers flowing to American K-12 schools. The primary conduit is the Chinese Guest Teacher Program, which boasts of being the largest Chinese visiting teacher program in the US, reaching tens of thousands of students. And since 2007, it has brought more than 1,600 Chinese teachers to the United States. The Chinese government's role in this program is to screen and send over Chinese nationals to teach in American schools and subsidize their salary. The College Board's role is to recruit the schools to host those teachers. And fourth, and perhaps most alarming, the College Board helps the CCP train American teachers of Chinese language. The result is that the College Board has enabled the Chinese government to effectively corner the market on Chinese language instruction at the K-12 level in the United States. Not only does the College Board bring in native Chinese speakers through Confucius Classrooms and the Chinese Guest Teacher Program, but it also helps the CCP build the institutions that train and shape the professional development for American teachers for years to come. The College Board does this primarily through the National Chinese Language Conference, which launched in 2007 and has grown to become the preeminent professional development experience for Chinese language teachers in the United States. It is perhaps one of the Chinese government's most effective investments in American education. It was at the 2014 conference that College Board CEO David Coleman made his revealing comments about the College Board seeking to reflect the light of the Hanban. The National Chinese Language Conference is the largest annual gathering in the U.S. of Chinese teachers, with more than 1,300 attendees in 2019. And since the conference launched, 14,600 people have attended. It has brought together an extraordinary number of key political figures: former U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, Neil Bush, the son of former President George H.W. Bush, and Utah Governor Gary Herbert, who spoke at the conference praising the Hanban's work to launch Chinese language immersion programs in Utah public schools. And for a time, the National Chinese Language Conference even enjoyed support of the U.S. federal government. During the Obama administration, senior staffers from the U.S. Department of State and Department of Education served on conference advisory committees. And in 2014, the Department of Education was even a conference sponsor. Now, we now know the dangers of close affiliation with the Chinese government. The College Board should heed those warnings and should sever its ties at once. Meanwhile, the federal government should undertake 5 reforms as well. First, we need an alternative to the AP Chinese language course. The Department of Education and Department of Defense should convene a working group to ensure that this rival course gives students an accurate, clear-eyed understanding of China and the CCP's regime. Second, school districts should pull out of Confucius Classrooms and the Chinese Guest Teacher Program, and the Department of Education should issue a warning to that effect. Congress should also condition federal funding on these changes. Third, Congress should also condition federal funding to the College Board on the immediate severance of its ties with the Chinese government. The College Board is a private, nonprofit organization, but it profits substantially from the federal government, receiving more than $116 million since 2008. Fourth, the Department of Justice should open an investigation documenting the College Board's corruption. And finally, we need an alternative to the National Chinese Language Conference. The Department of Defense, which funds Chinese flagship language programs at universities throughout the country, should sponsor an alternative at which it should dedicate prominent sessions to exposing the problems with Confucius Institutes, as well as program for Chinese dissidents and others whose voices the Chinese government have quashed. These measures are difficult but necessary because China has managed to build out an entire educational system before the public caught on to what has happened. It co-opted a prestigious, respected name, the College Board, gaining an access it could never have earned outright by working from within organizations that Americans knew and trusted. The United States is catching on to the game, but almost too late. Yet, with effort, we can roll back the Hanban's work and redeem the American educational system.
Thank you, Rachelle. Now I'd like to introduce our expert panel. Aside from Rachelle, joining us is Rory O'Connor, the president and chairman of the Athena Institute, a new nonprofit dedicated to limiting the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on U.S. college campuses. And we'll also hear from China specialist Professor Bruce Gilley, professor of political science at Portland State University and a National Association of Scholars board member. So Rachelle, what you've just described is, I think I wrote a tweet that said, I promise you all what you hear is going to be stunning. Hearing it again, and I've obviously looked through the report, it again is stunning to me. And the thing that strikes me here is that we've been talking a lot about removing the Confucius Institutes from American college campuses, but will removing even all the Confucius Institutes actually take away the influence of the Hanban and this whole institution? I have a big question mark in my mind right now.
Well, the Hanban has exerted itself far deeper into American society than just the Confucius Institutes at the college level. Those have gotten an enormous amount of well-deserved attention, but there are these Confucius classrooms sprinkled around the country at K-12 schools. The College Board sponsors 20 of those, but there are hundreds more unaffiliated with the College Board. And the depth of the Hanban's partnership with the College Board should really spur us to look closely at the rest of the ways the Chinese government has been insinuating itself into our institutions.
Rory, I wanted to switch to you and briefly, you've been doing some incredible work raising awareness on college campuses and frankly also, rare in our political reality, bipartisan work. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity just to mention what the Athena Institute is, what you're doing, and then connect it into the topic.
Well, thank you for that, Jan. The Athena Institute was set up this past May, really in response to the concerns of students who have been most affected by the Chinese Communist Party and its proxies on campus. On May 13th, we released the Washington Appeal, which was created really in an unprecedented manner that has really no other similar or comparable instance of sort of bipartisan interest or solidarity between college Republicans and college Democrats. What that really captures is the sentiment of our generation, really the concerns that we have and the failure of university administrations to address them. With this in mind, the Confucius Institute U.S. Center, in response to a lot of these things, has really only served to further highlight really the deceptive nature of it and those involved with it. It's something that students are most affected by, and yet it's something that only recently we've begun to take a very firm stance and stake in.
Professor Gilley, you've been mentioning, when we talked offline earlier, you talked about, this sort of the profound influence or the profound impact of having essentially Chinese Communist Party teachers, or this whole approach to education impacting how essentially all teaching around Chinese language is done, or most of it is done here in the US. Can you speak to that briefly, please?
Yes, well, thanks, Jan. Language is politics, and when you import the language of a communist regime, you are importing its politics. It's as straightforward as that. China has used language since 1949 as an effective tool of spreading its political propaganda and ideology, and no less important, squeezing out the traditional and liberal and humanistic heritage of Chinese culture from those who learn the Chinese language. And it's insidious, and it's been going on for 70 years. So it's not just about, what's in the textbook and what's not in the textbook, although that's important. But as Rachelle mentioned, the almost complete disappearance of traditional Chinese characters from Chinese language education is a major tragedy, not just political but cultural. And with that comes authoritarian grammar, the extremism of the Chinese language as it has developed in the last 70 years in China. And also with that comes, the sort of squeezing out of Mandarin dialects, which also in any normal pluralistic Chinese community, you would be teaching the different dialects. Cantonese, as spoken in Hong Kong, is actually far more traditional form of Chinese spoken than what our college learners are learning with Mandarin. So this is a kind of tip of the iceberg what this report is highlighting, and I think it will help to raise consciousness about what we need to do to push back this long takeover of the Chinese language.
Bruce, you just mentioned Hong Kong, and I was thinking about this. We're seeing in Hong Kong as we speak a kind of quick version of the application of the Chinese Communist Party approach to education being implemented forcefully. Your thoughts?
Yes, so Hong Kong's important in two senses. One is it shows what China's ultimate endgame is, which is to seize control of the Chinese language and eliminate rivals. But Hong Kong is also important because it is one of the two major Chinese communities left that uses traditional characters, the other being Taiwan, and which produces a robust literature, media publications, book publishers, education materials that are not in the control of China's communist regime yet. And so losing Hong Kong would not only be symbolically important, but it would be substantively important in terms of further defeats for non-communist approaches to Chinese language.
Let's jump back to the United States here. I'm going to take a question from our audience, from T42. Here's the question, and I think, Rachelle, we'll start with you. Where exactly does all this, quote, funding go? Who controls it? Follow the money. No communist entity has a comment. No foreign entity, especially a communist one, should have any kind of leverage or input into our education system, just as we have no input into theirs. But let's start with the question.
Well, that's a great question, highlighting also the issue of reciprocity, namely that China is aggressively seeking to interfere in our institutions, but won't even host American cultural centers in China. But where the funding comes from is straight from the Chinese government. These programs are being run through the Hanban, which is part of the Chinese Ministry of Education. The funding is flowing to the College Board, which is getting all sorts of sweeteners and funding. The College Board is not doing this out of pure goodwill or innate desire to promote Chinese language. It's doing this for the money, and it's been bought off. It's been persuaded that it can handle the risks of engaging with a Chinese communist regime, and that it can supposedly maintain integrity. But the evidence shows that it has not. It's really been corrupted from the inside out for the sake of chasing the money.
So, Rory, it's probably not too long that you actually did your SATs. And I'm wondering if you could actually speak to another question. This one's from GA2 Breezy. Please explain who the College Board actually is and their role in setting courses across colleges and universities. How does working with the board on designing a language and culture course affect the entire college and university program? Just trying to gain a better perspective on what the title means. Thank you.
Well, I must admit I haven't taken too many AP courses. With that in mind, though, effectively the College Board runs college credit courses in a sense if you test a certain level within high schools. Now, one of the issues is that if you're taking an AP course in Chinese language, for instance, where are they getting that material? They're getting it from the Chinese, really. They're getting it from proxies of the Chinese Communist Party. So AP courses are something, for instance, which are administered by, which are really, they have their curriculum set by the College Board. And in order for students to perhaps, be able to get ahead in college, for instance, and have to take less courses, or maybe not have a language requirement or something of that sort, they'll take an AP course, they test well, and then they don't have to do it. The problem is that it's sort of a very sneaky way of being able to influence students and young people when they're sort of most vulnerable and malleable.
And so how does that play out? Give me an example.
Of a student being malleable, for instance?
Of a student being influenced by something like this. I'm sure you've come across numerous ones.
Oh, well, as for the College Board goes, I would have to say that what's really more concerning is when you get to how Confucius Institutes have really been used as ways of trying to influence the education, not just in the College Board, but in K through 12. So I know of at least one anecdote in which you had a small child that they had a curriculum which was basically a package put together by staff members of the Confucius Institute at George Mason, actually. And among the things that were addressed were the Opium Wars. I believe the Cultural Revolution was fortunately left out, but there was a number of other things, especially pertaining to the Civil War and what have you, that were kept in, and you can only imagine what sort of things are being taught with that. There are kids who can point to a map and say that Taiwan belongs to China, and they're not saying that it's just the Republic of China. They're saying it because it's really the PRC's line. And when people are learning these things at such young ages, it's very, very concerning.
So I'm going to ask this question to the room. How is it possible that the Chinese Communist Party has gained such unprecedented influence over America's education system? Jump in.
I'll start off. First of all, China has been extremely aggressive. It has been promoting this relentlessly. It has been offering huge sums of money. The College Board, colleges and universities, other institutions have found it incredibly convenient to be co-opted by the Chinese government because they're being remunerated handsomely as a result. So one aspect of this is the money that's involved, but the Obama administration also is to blame for a lot of this. I mentioned earlier that under the Obama administration, the Department of Education and the Department of State were involved in the National Chinese Language Conference. The Department of Education was a co-sponsor of this conference. Again, this is a conference put forward by the Hanban, really orchestrated by the Hanban, using the College Board as the front to give it credibility and respectability. But then again, with veneer of respectability coming from the Obama administration's approval. So the policies of the federal government have in the past been very lax and have permitted this kind of proliferation of Chinese government influence. We're moving the other direction now, but we need to keep those lessons in mind.
Well, I would say, multiple times every week, I speak with officials, government officials, former government officials who tell me, I can't believe how fooled I was. I mean, essentially this kind of line, I believed we would put a lot of money into China, we would get goods out of it, and we would make them a democracy. This type of line, and clearly, this hasn't succeeded. But this isn't just from the previous administration. This is multiple administrations, right?
True. And there have been many goodwill efforts towards engagement with China. And many people who were sincerely trying and were fooled, as you mentioned. But we can't afford to be fooled. This is the integrity of our education system. This is our children and the next generation who are being shaped by a foreign authoritarian regime. This is something where we can't afford to run the risk. We have to clamp down on it.
Rory, please jump in.
Well, this is actually something with which I've dealt directly, considering that there are faculty whose names they don't wish to share for fear of what will actually happen to them if they speak out, whether because they have family in China or whether because they're worried that something will affect their research or their tenure. And really what happened, what has really happened is that it's been this idea of blind engagement in which we can completely separate, for instance, commercial interest from political interest or cultural ones, for instance. And the very, very scary fact about all of this is that those things aren't separate. Culture is used as a tool. Economics are used as a tool. You can't separate the politics from commercial interest, as is evident by the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, Nike's making their own products in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region or East Turkestan. This is something which has been going on for a very long time, and the real concern here is that universities sought interdependence with China, but the problem is, or rather the CCP and its proxies, but the problem with interdependence is that it requires the parties involved to have a common purpose, to have shared interests. And for the past few decades at least, the Chinese Communist Party has been, if not deceiving, oftentimes I would say college administrators and university administrators. Oftentimes it's faculty who are most ardently opposed to it, as evident by Marshall Salins, a socialist who spoke out against Confucius Institutes, for instance. So really what we're seeing is that they've embedded themselves and they've tried as best as they can to latch themselves onto our institutions and to really, I hesitate to use the phrase elite capture, but they've tried to really harness the sort of centers of power and what have you at universities. And it's something which I would say the effects we can hardly even comprehend. It's something which is ongoing, and students are facing the brunt of this. And it's what's most concerning. It's what has most motivated something as large and as unprecedented as the Washington Bill.
Professor Gilly, as a faculty member yourself, your perspective here?
Well, it's interesting to compare the problems we have with Chinese language education with the problems we did not have with Russian language education before 1989. And the question is, well, what's the difference? Well, there's two things at play. One is China is an immensely more powerful, wealthy, and globalized society than Russia was during the Cold War. And as a result, China has a lot more push going on in terms of its people flows, its teacher flows, its money, its linkages to the global supply chain. And of course, that feeds right into Chinese language education in terms of, the basic issues of supply chain of textbooks, media materials, and whatnot. But the other thing, which I think Rachelle is highlighting correctly, and Rory as well, is the receptivity on our end is much greater to Chinese influence, whereas in the Cold War, we were very aware that we didn't want Stalinist literature for our students of Russian language. We wanted them to be reading the Russian classics. And for some reason, we think it's okay for literature and textbooks coming out of communist China to be normalized among our student population. So I think that pull side is important to keep in mind. And honestly, there is as Rory has pointed out, people say, well, we don't want to be cold warriors, we don't want to be anti-China and xenophobic and whatnot. And yet, that's an absurd argument because it's got nothing to do with the Chinese people. Indeed, the Chinese people are our allies in this struggle to recover their authentic culture. And what's really at stake here is getting over this idea that challenging the PRC on language is anything except good education policy, which is what it should be.
Well, so that makes me think of one of the questions from Dean Winchester here. I'll, whoever would like to take this one, please go ahead. Is there any direct link between the Chinese Communist Party and the large number of American educators that promote communist ideologies in U.S. classrooms?
Well, I would say, Jan, that there is. I mean, I think that's a rhetorical question because we know the answer is yes. On my campus, for instance, we had a debate on our Confucius Institute. And there were two prominent faculty members who spoke out in favor of the Confucius Institute. One of whom is a well-known socialist and communist who regularly appears on Russian state television and is a virile critic of the United States, and says that any attempt to push back on Confucius Institutes would just play into Cold Warrior McCarthyism, right? And so I think we can trace those linkages very clearly between far left faculty who espouse communist and socialist ideas and the receptivity to the language and teaching materials of a communist state, of course.
Any further thoughts?
Well, if I may add, I do go to Catholic University, so there are less socialists and communists there as one might suspect. With that in mind, though, I do have to say that what I find most concerning occurring at colleges is not so much that there are some socialist and communist professors and so forth. Granted, I don't have that much exposure to them, but what I find most concerning are the number of outdated or the number of faculty or really university administrators who possess really outdated views on such things as engagement and what have you. They still use the same win-win, and they still use the same McCarthyist and trying to create a better global interconnected society, all the different talking points of the Chinese Communist Party that they've been echoing for the past 20 years, they're still repeating them. So what we're seeing, and I mean, this is, I think, evident in our think tanks, for instance, in which it appears as though it's the moderate ones that are oftentimes most deeply, I would say, influenced and sort of corrupted by really the money and resources of the Chinese Communist Party. And then what's really happening is that you also have a number of students who are becoming increasingly disaffected. They feel as though they have lost the means in order to actually take control of what actually happens to them and the consequences of their action and so forth. And in trying to seek some form of agency, they end up adopting the false narratives and the false hopes of this legalistic, fascist, Stalinist entity that's under the guise of Marxism. It's something which is very, very, very concerning, and in a sense, it sort of is an ironic example of the false consciousness of which Marxists so often accuse others of.
Fascinating. Now, so the reality today, I'll jump to Rachelle, but I'd like to hear from everybody. Is the Chinese Communist Party influence actually, in reality, lessening on campus?
That is a very timely question, Jan, because on first glance, the answer is yes, that colleges and universities are walking away from their Confucius Institutes in droves. I think we're now at 54 colleges and universities that are closing their Confucius Institutes. They're severing some of these ties. But if you look really closely at a lot of those announcements and those stories, you'll see that many colleges and universities are not really closing their Confucius Institutes. They're opening up new centers for Asian studies. They're transferring the bulk of the staff of the Confucius Institute over to that new center. They're still getting the same funding from the Chinese government, maybe routed a little bit differently. But there are a lot of indications that a significant number of colleges and universities are just pulling a PR stunt. They're executing this sleight of hand, claiming that they're being cautious and protecting national security by closing these Confucius Institutes, when really they're not. So even as we celebrate the closure of Confucius Institutes and the lessening of some of these overt ties to the Chinese Communist government, we need to take a hard look at each of those institutions and make sure that those colleges and universities are truly learning the lessons and not just executing this sleight of hand.
Rory, from what I understand, you and your organization are actually actively working on trying to ensure this influence lessens. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I don't think there's very much clear evidence that CCP influence and interference efforts are actually lessening on campus. They become less obvious, but if anything, they've become more sinister as a result. I have friends and I have acquaintances who are Uyghurs, who are Hong Kongers, who are Chinese international students who are terrified of what will happen to them. There are folks who have to tell their professors not to show images of Tiananmen Square because they're worried that their classmates will report them simply for not reporting the professor for showing them such images. That's something which is still going on at American colleges and universities. And oftentimes, many of the universities, if they do actually close Confucius Institutes, for instance, do so apologetically and half-heartedly. Now, frankly, for institutions which are supposed to uphold freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and protect the rights of students above all else and not subordinate their principles to their bottom line, I have to say that it is startling to see it continue to happen. Now, with that in mind, if there is one thing that has come out of this, and if there is one thing that I think ought to give faith to those who actually still believe that universities can do what they're supposed to do and what they've written down as being obligated to do, frankly, what brought together folks my age from all across the aisle at a time when polarization, especially among my generation, is, I don't know if it's fair to say the worst on record, but I think it's banal to say that it's bad. With that in mind, it's sincerity. It's the fact that we're tired of cynicism, we're tired of appearances, we're tired of lies, whether it's from administrators or Confucius Institutes or faculty that are somehow beholden to the CCP. It doesn't really matter because, frankly, we have friends that can't speak out and who are worried about speaking out and just doing what students ought by right to be able to do. And that's to say nothing of the faculty that are intimidated. That's to say nothing of the fact that Chinese scholars in the United States are still kept track of. But the startling reality is, despite the fact that we had hundreds of organizations from across the country and we united action with effort and we were sincere and we did the best we possibly could with what we have, and we didn't try and pursue this effort out of some odd xenophobic hatred or anything of that sort, but out of simply love and a sense of duty for what we ought to preserve. The fact that we did that and universities have remained silent, I think that that's unfortunately telling, and I think that that's quite depressing, but it's not something that's going to stop students. It's not something that's going to stop those who are still being actively silenced and oppressed and allowed to be oppressed and allowed to be censored by their universities. Because, frankly, everything that we have is at stake. This is an issue of sincere personal attachment, not just to me, but to the other folks involved. And frankly, it's very easy for me to get up here and say all of this, especially compared to the fact that, again, I have friends who can't speak out and who can't say what is actually going on if they're a Uyghur, what's happening in East Turkestan or the XUAR, because their family is basically being held hostage by them, and they receive messages on, I believe, WeChat or what have you, or Hong Kongers that have cried me asking what's going to happen to their family if they've already broken the national security law. These are things that have actually happened. These are young people who are facing these things, and university administrators are doing nothing, and it's shameful.
Before I take other voices, Roy, I know there's a lot of young folks also watching and very interested in the topic and maybe not, in some cases, not knowing who to reach out to. And I wanted to give you a chance to just tell us how they can reach you and your organization.
Well, I encourage you to reach out at athena.org, or you can actually get me on my email at roy@athena. I'm okay with doing that, by the way. And Gao Xing, if you're watching, hope you're well.
So, Professor Gilley, we just heard an impassioned, plea to basically colleges around America to respond to these, very, very difficult realities. What are your thoughts?
So I think this is very important, as we've talked about before. This is the tip of the iceberg, but let's remind ourselves of what a long road we have to march here. There's significant sunk costs and significant irreversibility to what's happened to Chinese language education around the world since 1949. And basically, one of the problems is that most Chinese language teachers in the United States now, they cannot read or write traditional characters. They themselves lack access to non-communist Chinese language. So in terms of the constituency, because as an educator, I know that you can pass as many mandates and laws as you want, but educational reform requires the buy-in of the educators themselves. And so one of the big challenges is how do we work with our Chinese language teachers, not just at the college level, but significantly at the K-12, and in particular the K-8 level, to incentivize them and help them to turn away from simplified characters and Chinese textbooks and whatnot, because that's a big practical problem, because we've got basically 70 years of sunk costs in PRC Chinese language materials. So, this is something I think you talk about some creativity from the policymakers, very important here. We have a tremendous community of Chinese language teachers in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, also in Southeast Asia, although the Confucius Institute and Chinese influence on Chinese language education in Southeast Asia is even more corrosive. But there's a constituency out there that we could work with, that we could fund. I would have no problems seeing my tax monies going to help Taiwan and Hong Kong Chinese language teachers come to America. There's some creativity there, I think, on the policy side, but just keep in mind this is a big irreversibility problem that we're going to have to tackle.
Well, okay, so I imagine there's a lot of people watching right now that are, horrified. might be a term I expect by this reality, and it might seem insurmountable. There's this irreversibility issue that you mentioned, Bruce. The question is, people will be thinking to themselves, what can I do here? In the face of this, universities don't seem to be acting, or perhaps even avoiding, as Rachelle was describing earlier, actually dealing with the issue. How can the typical person watching today have an impact on changing the way this reality?
Well, one first step is just simply don't send your kids to a Confucius Classroom or a Confucius Institute or a school that is using the Chinese guest teacher program. Many parents want their students to learn Chinese. I understand that it is an important language, but don't go the Confucius Institute, Confucius Classroom route. It's not worth it. Second, for average Americans, hold your local institutions accountable. Parents, go to your local school district and petition them to close their Confucius Classroom, to get out of the Chinese guest teacher program, to cut off these ties. These are changes that can be made at the local level. Parents can have immense sway over that. And at the policy level, you can reach out to your state legislators. There are state bills starting to circulate. Rory's group has a model legislation, the Athena Act, which is really excellent. And at the federal level, there are bills being circulated as well, including the Confucius Act, which passed the Senate earlier this summer. So it's not as though there's nothing that we can do. There are steps that can be taken. It is a long road ahead, as Bruce said, but there are immediate, tangible ways that we can start.
Rory, why don't you talk about the Athena Institute model legislation for a moment, and then tell us, at the grassroots level, what do you think people can do?
Well, Jan, there is just something that I want to say. I think it's only right that people are afraid, and I don't think it's necessarily problematic, so long as people are afraid of what it is that we actually have to lose and what is at stake. And it's not actually lost, but it very well can be, because what we really need to do is remember that democracy isn't just something that occurs in the voting booth once a year. It's not just something that occurs in DC or any state capital for that matter. It's something that occurs every single day. It occurs in our individual actions, and it occurs in every single expression of our dignity. And right now, Uyghurs aren't able to do that. In fact, Uyghur intellectuals, as they're being rounded up and their culture is being extinguished by the Chinese Communist Party, and it's being torn apart by those who are committing the most heinous acts over there. I mean, frankly, universities ought to be offering a place of refuge there. Beyond that, though, what I think is very important to state, and to get into the very specifics of this is something that has to be done continuously. It has to be done constantly. It has to be done vigilantly. Students, if you're interested in this, if you have friends that have been affected by this, reach out to us. Reach out to, hell, any journalist that you know. It can be a local one. You know, we're all for supporting local papers in a time like this. Reach out to the Epoch Times, for instance. Beyond that, get involved. Get active. Do something. Organize webinars. Beyond that, support the Athena Act. It's state-level model legislation that we've made, so that way we can combat Confucius Institutes at their source, and that we can hold these proprietary institutions of authoritarian regimes accountable. That's something which you can very easily do, because frankly, state legislators would oftentimes very much prefer to handle an issue like this than have to handle a pothole or something like that. So take that as you will, but at the federal level, call your member of Congress, ask them to support the Confucius Act. That's been sitting around for a while, but it's something that ought to have bipartisan support. I mean, frankly, one of the most unifying issues of our time is the fact that what we have and what we ought to hold dear has been, what ought to belong to all of us has been taken by a few and sold to the Chinese Communist Party and its proxies. And that's not right. And they're vulnerable. And frankly, as our institutions, which ought to terrify the Chinese Communist Party, are now fearful of them and submissive of them and seeking to accommodate them, hold them accountable. Don't let up. Frankly, we had the largest movement in support of really reasserting democracy and the rights of students and the rights of faculty and protections for international students above all else, and condemning condemning racism as it occurs and xenophobia as it has occurred as people backlash against the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Take these issues seriously, take them sincerely, but frankly, it's something that has to be done continuously, and it has to be done really forcefully.
Rory, just very briefly, what the bullet points on the Athena Act, model legislation?
Oh, I'm very glad you mentioned this. There's a policy wonk in me. The Athena Act basically does a number of, it's quite short actually. It calls for universities to effectively have state funding, because this is again model legislation for states, immensely reduced, and certain funding taken away from them if they don't get rid of Confucius Institutes by, I believe it's January 1st or January 21st of this year. Really depends on the state that's passing it. But with that in mind, it's something that should have been taken long ago, and it's something that's really just a necessary step to reassert and reinforce and maintain academic freedom. It's something which is bipartisan. It's something which is very clear cut. I mean, it's not in legalese and anyone can make sense of it. And I encourage you to check it out on our website and make what you can out of it.
So let's talk about the 5 recommendations that the report that we're looking at today has. And maybe, Rachelle, if you can remind us, why don't we start with number 1 and just kind of give me a sense of how to tackle this?
Well, we need a replacement for the AP Chinese Language and Culture test. It has been corrupted by the Chinese government. The College Board is not really likely to execute key reforms. The College Board has been one by one corrupting other AP tests. The National Association of Scholars has been tracking that on AP US History, which is now being taught as the history of an oppressive regime, and AP European History, which is being taught in similar fashion, but now AP Chinese Language and Culture as well. The College Board effectively has a monopoly over much of K-12 education. It needs a rival. We need alternatives. We need to develop an alternative test that gives students a more robust and in-depth understanding of Chinese language and culture that doesn't reduce them to just simplified characters, but also ensures that students have a more clear-eyed understanding of the CCP and its regime.
Where is the biggest impact that can be had at this exact moment from your perspective, Professor Gilly, in terms of action, policymakers?
Well, I think this is a classic example of where we could have a whole of government approach. It's a buzzword, but sometimes the buzzword is good. We've seen whole of government executive orders come out on a number of things. Here's a very easy issue where a simple executive order, whole of government executive order, requiring that Chinese language use and Chinese language communications and things relating to Chinese language education pull away from the use of first of all simplified characters. That would be huge, and I would greatly support it. And it's not that difficult to do in the era of technology. We have very easy ways to transition to traditional characters. And I think just in terms of our embassies, our State Department, its operations in the international diplomatic sphere, of course, Chinese captured the United Nations back in the 50s. That was part of their negotiations for coming in. But that doesn't mean that the United States needs to just follow the flow. Indeed, the United States has always been a beacon of democracy, and here's an area where I think whole of government executive order, just reminding executive and departmental agencies at the federal level that Chinese language is not to be taught or promoted using PRC materials, that we should talk about or transition back to traditional Chinese characters. This could make a big difference, because a lot of this, Jan, is really about consciousness raising. If those parents are going to reach out to their schools, I mean, I'm a few blocks away from Oregon's only fully publicly funded Mandarin immersion K-8 school, and it is chock full of PRC teachers and materials. So, but those parents don't know; they don't understand this. So I think there's a necessary connection between grassroots activism, which I agree with Rory and Rachelle. This is absolutely important, but you don't get the activism until you have this sort of whole of government top-down calling out what the problem is, and then letting democracy do its work.
Rory, your thoughts, the top policy point to hit first? I don't know if it's the Athena Act or not, but go ahead.
Frankly, divestment. I would say that it's really divestment. It's something which is very, very difficult to do, because there are hundreds of millions, if not, and Rachelle, I encourage you to correct me on this, billions of dollars going into American universities each year from the Chinese or their Chinese Communist Party or its proxies. And there was a letter sent by the State Department this past August, and universities largely remained silent towards it if they reacted at all. What we need right now is, speaking as a student to students, we need to reassert ourselves in a way that hasn't been seen since the South African divestment movement of the 1980s, because frankly, that's what we're facing right now. If anything, this is something where the stakes could almost not be higher, considering that we're looking at the possible extermination of an entire culture in East Turkestan. Even in the United States, there's refuge for Uyghurs here who are continually oppressed and suppressed and intimidated by the Chinese and their various nefarious little actors over here. But the bigger issue is that people just pay attention and keep up the pressure. Because frankly, universities, if they could, would wait these issues out. It's obvious that they don't want to address these. It's obvious that it's very difficult for them to, because frankly, students have, not just with the effort that we had recently, but in the past, faculty have in the past brought these issues up, and university administrators have frankly ignored them. And it's something which isn't that difficult to do, considering what horrible things are already happening to others, what rights are not afforded and what rights are denied to students within our own country. And that's something that we can fix, and that's something that we need to fix. Because democracy, again, is not something which is inevitable. It's not something which you simply have or attain. It's something which is exercised, and it's something which is a way of life.
Rachelle, you can jump back to some of the recommendations or comment. I saw that Rory was asking for your perspective here.
Well, I want to emphasize again that we need to set up alternatives. Right now, the Chinese government has effectively cornered the market on K-12 instruction in Chinese language. They're sending over Chinese nationals to teach. The CCP is at the same time training the Americans who are going to teach Chinese language. They're funding the College Board, funding these Confucius Institutes and Classrooms, funding all of these programs, and effectively, really, the College Board has enabled the CCP to get its fingers on every aspect of K-12 Chinese language instruction. So we need to develop alternatives ASAP, not just an AP test, as I mentioned before, but alternatives for training teachers, alternatives for getting teachers into these programs. We're at a real crossroads here, and the College Board has let the Chinese government be the only game in town.
So we're going to be finishing up fairly soon, and I'm going to give each of you now about a minute to offer any final closing thoughts, final remarks. Let's start with Bruce.
Well, I just want to remind people that, our biggest allies in this battle are the people of China themselves, because they're the ones who've been the biggest victim to the abuse and misuse of the Chinese language by the Chinese Communist Party since 1949. And, these battles actually go on in China as well. Just last year, the PRC government revised its middle school Chinese literature textbook, and they removed a very famous Qin dynasty story about a peasant rebel and replaced it with a Han Dynasty story about a law-abiding general who kept the people in line. And there was a tremendous outcry about that and pushback. And so just keep in mind that, this isn't us against China, this is us against the Communist Party. And our allies in this struggle for the Chinese language are the Chinese people themselves.
Rory?
Freedom is something which, again, is not really attained. It's something which is posited, and you have to fight for it. You have to do something. You have to take hold of the responsibility which ought to be yours, which is yours, and which you're obligated to exercise, considering that students are most affected by these issues. Students are the ones who face threats and intimidation and suppression every day in the United States and elsewhere because of the inaction of university administrators and the ignorance of others. It's something that can be addressed and which we must address. They're vulnerable. We can do something about it. It's not inevitable, but we have to act.
And Rachelle, it's only fitting that you offer the final words.
Thank you, Jan. We are reckoning with the realization that the American education system has been corrupted from the inside out, from kindergarten level all the way up to higher education, through the Chinese guest teacher program, Confucius Institutes, Confucius Classrooms. Colleges and universities are to blame for some of this. The College Board is to blame for this as well. But individual school districts, individual leaders have made these mistakes as well. And we need to turn around now. We need to develop alternatives, and we need to root out the pernicious influence of the CCP. We cannot let the next generation of Americans be trained by the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, this has been an incredibly fascinating discussion. A few quick observations from my side. We are seeing, for example, in Australia, we are seeing, government reviews of university or college actions against students and so forth. So this is something that is happening. Not just these realities are something that not just the United States is facing. Certainly, Canada, my home country, is facing. Australia is facing, and we are seeing some sort of action happen. I certainly hope that a lot of the recommendations and thoughts that have been discussed here, especially on the policy side, are taken quite seriously. Another piece I think that's very important is, Rory's work, which is basically he's made huge efforts to make sure that the work of the Athena Institute has been bipartisan and reaching across the aisle. And frankly, I really appreciate the idea of engaging young folks. Sometimes, we don't have a lot of faith in our young people. We're told that they're not that engaged, they're not that interested in what's going on. They're just very self-focused. But I think we have a very stark example here with us today of at least one student, and of course representing many others who obviously have a very serious approach to all of this. Finally, I wanted to invite everyone to come to the website, the web page, theepochtimes.com. And it's theepochtimes.com/corrupted-by-China. The different contacts will be available there. You'll be able to reach out to the National Association of Scholars, and you'll be able to reach out to the Athena Institute and Rory through the information on there. I encourage you, whatever platform you're watching on, YouTube, Facebook, the website, our app, to please like this video, share it with your friends. If you're watching on television, please also share it with everyone. And finally, if you would like to subscribe to the Epoch Times, join Epoch, join epoch.com. Thank you, everybody.